You guys ready to start? And is my voice coming through loud and clear? Perfect. No reverb, not too aggressive. No, okay. But hey, thanks for coming tonight. If you're here, you're probably a dork or a geek, because to go to a lecture on the Shroud of Turin on a Saturday night, either that or you have no friends. But you can make friends with the dorks here. Nice. Show of hands. Who here believes the Shroud of Turin is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus Christ? Oh. So the minority. Who thinks it's not? Who here is completely undecided? That's about a third. 30. All right. Well, we're going to do a scientific analysis, and then we'll do a re-poll at the end. Now, oh, by the way, anything you want to watch, all our past lectures, this lecture will be online. It's being recorded, so it'll be on our YouTube channel, and it's youtube.com/commercial A. You have to have the commercial A, what Christians believe. So if there's anything you want to review or check out or send to friends, you go to that particular website. Can you guys see me good too? I'm not like a voice in the dark? Okay. Religious relics. Now, there was a time in medieval history where there was quite a fairly lucrative trade foiling rich people out of their money, selling them relics. So relics typically have a bad name, especially outside the Catholic realm. Not all relics are created equal. There's a handful of true cross relics around the world. This one's in Waterford Cathedral in Ireland. It's carbon dated to the 1000s AD. The thing about wood is it's fairly easy to carbon date, but this thing is sitting encapsulated in a box in a cathedral in Ireland, and a lot of people throughout the years have believed it's an authentic piece of the cross. That's not impossible, but in this case it's not really testable, and the testing we have done puts it at 1,000 years too late, puts it right around the time in which religious relic sales were a thing, where it was easy to bilk people out of their money during the medieval ages using fake relics. This one, do you guys know what this one is? That's a crystal ring holding what's supposed to be the crown of thorns that Jesus had on his head. Now, it is, we can trace it back to, it's been in the Paris Notre Dame. Sorry, it was taken in 1063 AD, taken from Jerusalem to Constantinople. In 1238, King Louis IX took it to Paris, where it's been ever since, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Now, a couple of years ago, there was a major fire in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Now, they saved this relic. They actually formed a chain. Firefighters and church workers formed a human chain to pull all these artifacts out of the cathedral in time, and this one was actually saved. No one's done any carbon dating on it. There's absolutely no way to verify this. We just have a long-term history of people believing this is the crown of thorns of Jesus. Again, untestable, therefore I have no opinion on it. Now there's other types of religious relics. Can you guys see Jesus in this tortilla shell? Right? Yeah, well, you were wrong. That's Jesus. And yeah, so anyways, I mean, can you really eat that tortilla now? I guess he said he was the bread of life. Maybe you should eat it. I don't know. Here's how about this? This is a pub in Ireland. Do you guys see Jesus pontificating up on the wall here? This is actually posted on relics, religious relics online. And how about this oil stain in the maintenance garage? Does that look like Jesus with sunglasses, I guess? I don't know. Again, this is more the lighthearted examples. Here's a question. What is the most studied, scientifically analyzed, not necessarily studied or written about, but what is the most scientifically studied artifact by far in all of human history? No, we don't have it to study. Anybody want to venture a guess? The Shroud. It's the #1 most scientifically analyzed artifact, period. Now, people have studied things like the Rosetta Stone, the pyramids, and stuff like that. But as far as specifically testing it scientifically, Shroud is #1. It's gotten more attention than anything else. It's probably the most famous Well, it's the most famous piece of cloth in history. I can't think of another piece of clothing or cloth that's more famous. Everyone's heard of the Shroud of Turin. You haven't? Who's, sorry? Okay, can you keep your comments for afterwards? There's a Q&A section at the end. All right, so the shroud is this. It's been around for at least 1,000 years or 800 years. It's the oldest record we have of it. It measures 14 feet by 5 inches, 3 feet by 7 inches. Now that's an odd measurement in our imperial measurement system, right? But curiously enough, it happens to be exactly 8 by 2 cubits. Now, who used cubits as measurements, standard measurements that we know of? Which civilization for sure used cubits as an item of measurement? Right? Well, the ancient world, but also the Israelites. And because the reason you think, how can a back and front image be on the same unit of linen? Well, because burial shrouds were used like this. You put the body on one side and you fold it over sandwich style onto the front. So if an image was given off by whatever object was in there, you'd get on the same piece of cloth a front and a back image. Now, the history of the shroud's possession, it starts off, this is an animated chronicles of a knight in the Fourth Crusade named Robert of Clary. Now, he took part in the Fourth Crusade, and in his memoirs, he writes about a shroud in Constantinople being raised up every Friday for the public to see, a shroud of Jesus. Now, he doesn't draw it, he doesn't describe it. We have no idea if he's talking about the shroud that we have. But curiously enough, about 150 years later, this gentleman, Geoffrey de Charnay, he was the procurator of the Knights Templar in France. And in the 1300s, so 100 years after the first guy I just showed you, he's the one who first has a record of possessing the Shroud of Turin we have today. Now, he was married to a descendant of a leader of the Fourth Crusade, which is where we just saw was the first mention of the shroud in Constantinople. Again, now in 1532 AD, there was a fire in the chapel, and by the way, at this time, it was held in Liry, France. It wasn't in Turin, Italy at the time. In 1532, there was a fire in the chapel that housed the shroud, and part of the silver melted. You see those triangular-shaped holes that you'll see? There's eight of them throughout the shroud. That's because it was folded over in 4 and doubled over, and the same exact melted melted silver fell onto the shroud, causing this damage. Which, of course, you know when you make snowflakes with your kids for Christmas, you fold the paper over and cut the same holes in it. But that's what you're seeing. That's the damage it took in the fire in 1532. Now, in 1578, the Savoy family moved it from France to the St. John Baptist Cathedral in Italy, in Turin, Italy, where it is still housed to this day. It's been there for hundreds of years. And it's very sporadically shown to the public. For example, there was a showing in 2000, then again in 2010 and 2015, and there's a next scheduled showing is in 2025. So they have to keep it in hermetically sealed, light-constrained environment because they don't want it to degrade at all. Now, I want to show you an up-close picture of the facial features on the shroud. Now, you'll see here, there's a few key features that I want you to note. You see sort of the enlarged eye socket appearance around here. It looks oversized for a normal face, right? There's also an overly elongated nose that goes down, again, longer than what would seem natural for a facial feature. The hair is parted down the middle, goes down the sides. There's a forked beard, which is kind of hidden by this line right here. There's a forked beard, if you can see that. And by the way, this line is a pool of blood. If the shroud had been pushed down here and blood had trickled off the head of the whatever caused this image, it pooled along the crease as it was tucked under the neck down the body. There's an angled line. Can you see that right here? There's an angled line and a discoloration that kind of goes like this. So keep that in mind. There's a slight length of hair on the right compared to the left. That's the hair mark right there, and it goes kind of tucks out and a little further down than on the right-hand side. There's the angle of the mustache and beard under the lip. You see it kind of droops downwards. Now, keep those features in mind, and we're going to look at a series of iconographies of Jesus over the years. So here's a 17th century picture of Jesus, and it's clearly made off of the shroud. That's why it's drawn on a shroud. This is hundreds of years after we knew we had it. And you see the forked beard, the oversized eyes, the elongated nose, the shadow on the right side. It's another feature you'll see. There's a line of white on the right side, on the left side of the nose, but a darker patch on the right. And you're seeing it staying true to an image that's similar to the shroud. And the hair is parted down the middle and goes down. Now, if we backtrack to the 12th century, so before we have record of it being possessed by Geoffrey de Charny, if we go to this image, this is 100 years before we have any record of having the shroud, do you see the similarity in the imagery? You have the same type of hair, it droops a little further down on the right than the left. There's this weird line, notice the angle of the neck line that you'll see in every single picture of Jesus, even going back to the 2nd century or the 3rd century. Forked beard, the drooping mustache and beard, oversized eye, prominent brow. There's another thing I forgot to tell you about, the prominent brow. Oversized eyes, elongated nose, shadow on the right side of the nose. Let's go to the 11th century and seeing a similar, again, iconography. Oversized eyes, right-sided shadow on the nose, elongated nose, forked beard, hairstyle, angle of the beard and mustache around the chin. We're going to go to a fresco in Ponziano's catacombs in Italy. This dates to the 200s AD. And unfortunately, there's a huge chunk missing from the wall chip there. Do you see the similarities? Okay, the hairstyle is the same. Oversized eyes, elongated nose, angle of the mustache, and that same strange line. Do you see that? You see it pretty much in all. And here's another one. The last one I'll show you is, this is from the Sinai region, a monastery from the 500s AD. And again, do you see the similarity? The hairstyle, the angle of the neckline, the forked beard, slightly forked beard, the angle of the mustache, oversized eyes, elongated nose, and that right-sided shadow. So clearly, at least the iconography of the image of Jesus throughout the years has followed a staple image. Question is it the shroud as that staple image? Here's coinage from the early 700s AD, and this is after Rome has become Christianized, and it says King of Kings, and here's the image of Jesus. Once again, all the features are there. Elongated nose, oversized eyes, prominent brow, forked beard, hair slightly flowing longer on the right than the left, and the parted hair exact same. Somebody somewhere is following a pattern of an image that's considered the standard image of Jesus. Okay? Now, obviously, if the shroud is a medieval era forgery, it could have done the same thing, right? We don't know what that image was for sure, but it does match the features of the shroud. Now, in the 1800s, we developed what? Photography. So we started taking pictures of stuff. Somebody took a picture of the shroud in 1890, and then they went to develop their picture and they saw the negative of the image. Turns out, again, you got to remember, if a light source or whatever put an impression on the shroud, if it was something other than paint or dye, would basically be leaving on the shroud a negative image. So a negative of the negative would be the positive image that's on the shroud. And a tremendous amount of detail, and better photographs have been taken since the 1890s of the shroud. And we can analyze, there's a lot more detail coming out of the shroud on its negative image than on just looking at the shroud. And it makes sense of a lot of stuff. So, and here you see the torso and the arms hanging down. A medieval forgerer, okay, if it's a medieval forgery, A medieval forger would have to understand the concepts of photography. It was unknown back then. How do you leave an image on purpose that's a negative of an image? The concept of that was unknown at the time. It wasn't known until the 1800s, right? Puts a dent in the idea that this was a clever forgery. Now, STRP. Anybody here heard of STRP? It stands for the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Now, it was led by, now this was in, they prepped, they knew they were going to be given access to the Shroud of Turin, unprecedented access. So a bunch of nerds from all these different universities throughout the Western world prepared for 2 years, because they were going to be given 5 24-hour periods, 5 around the clock for 5 days. They're going to have access to the shroud and be able to test it, take samples from it, do all this stuff, photograph it, etc. So they prepped for 2 years, because it was like going into a military operation. They knew they had to move fast. You come in right after this guy. After you're done, this guy comes in, and we're going to just do every test imaginable on this shroud. And the project lasted 5 days, but the research, the chemical analyses, the photographic analyses lasted 3 years. Okay, they're the most rigorous testing that's ever been done on any piece of artifact in history. And the physicist John P. Jackson, thermodynamics expert Eric Jumper, photography expert William Mortem, nuclear physicist Tom DeMahala, thermal chemist Ray Rogers, he comes up later, and people from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. So pretty much a who's who of the scientific community showed up, and they had an army of scientists and PhD students with them to do everything properly and quickly. And here's the images from that 5-day period. So, chemical analyses. What did the chemical analyses of the shroud tell us? So they took samples from the foot area, the foot image on the shroud, and it tested consistent with the type of calcium that's found in limestone that has been reproduced from the Garden Tomb and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which are both where? In Jerusalem. So it's Jerusalem regional limestone samples stuck in the foot area of the shroud. Again, anybody over 150 years ago have any idea that you could test dirt and come up with a chemical compound signature? No. So a medieval forger would not have known about stuff like that. It wouldn't have crossed their mind if this was a European-based medieval forgery. They tested the pollen found in there. Max Frey, who's a criminologist, he's a botanist and an expert in Mediterranean flora, found 58 different pollen strains, 16 of which are from plant species found never in France or Italy. 54 of the 58 pollen strains are from plant species specifically found in Jerusalem. Very interesting. Remember when it says in the scriptures, he was packed with the burial customs of the Jews, which was about 70 pounds worth of aloes and myrrh. How do you make aloe and myrrh? Plants, right? In 2012, there was an immunological review of the blood on the shroud. There's stains that I'll show you that are blood stains. What you see in those stains areas, it's the only part of the shroud that has any sort of chemical signature on it, something imprinted in on it. And what you find in there is remnants of hemoglobin, bilirubin, and albumin. What body tissues have those proteins in them? Blood. And they specifically typed it as AB blood, and it's the blood of a primate. That's as much as they can specify. Now, we humans fall in the primate category, obviously, and the image on the shroud is not that of a chimp, right? So that's consistent. With ultraviolet light tests, 10 different chemical tests, they've shown the presence of proteins consistent with blood. And the immunological evidence says that it's consistent with primate blood. And if you look at, there is, on the scalp region, and we'll see that in a second, there's a pattern of blood circumferentially around the skull region above the forehead. What does that sound like to you? Right? The wound signature of a crown of thorns, perhaps. Now, this gentleman, his name is Bob Buckland. He's one of these strange people who seems to know a bit about everything. He's a medical doctor. He's a lawyer. He was the chief pathologist on this Shroud of Turin research team in '78. He's a University of Houston medical law professor and the former LA County coroner. He's passed away now, but this is him, I think, back in the '90s. So he says he's the one who identified it initially, but it's been redone since. The blood marks on the Shroud of Turin are specifically blood marks. He explained the raised hair in the image, because if you look at the image, the hair seems to be right down the sides at the same level of the cheekbones. Now, hair does not get rigor mortis. So a dead body on its back, the hair should float away from the front of the image. So he said that most likely some sort of head wrapping was used on top of the shroud, not on top of the shroud, but as well as the shroud, probably underneath the shroud, and this is again consistent with Jewish burial face cloth sim. The word cloth, because it says face cloth in John chapter 20, but face cloth, the root, if you look at the classical use of that same Greek word in Roman and Greco-Roman literature of the time, it usually designates something that's rolled up kind of like in a handkerchief style, like a headband style, and wrapped around either the wrist or the head, either this way, like those cartoons where somebody has a toothache, or around here. It's not necessarily clothed over the head or wrapped mummy style, right? We don't know exactly what it meant to have the face cloth, but it looks like something was padding the hair and wrapping the head this way. The blood pattern, you see that's the hair is saying, and the hair's at the same level as the face. And this is the back of the head image, all the way around at the top of the head. Here, these are all these white streaks or blood marks. All the blood marks go around the head in this pattern of distribution, like that. And if you look at the blood on the arms, the wound starts in the wrist, and it flows up the forearm. Now, have you ever cut yourself and you're holding your hand in like that? Where would the blood go? Down your hand. How could the blood go against gravity? Right, if the arms were raised at the time of wounding, then that would explain why it would spiral down. It goes in spiral marks down the forearm. So it's consistent with someone whose wrist wounds were done in an upwards position. What's interesting too is the blood stains are all done by superficial contact. So somebody would have to have been bleeding, the blood semi-congeals, and then something is laid over it in a light surface contact style. And almost nothing, the background images on the shroud left their mark on the shroud without ever having made contact with the shroud. Now again, if I paint a statue as a medieval forger, put it on a cloth and put it over, and I want to get an image of the three-dimensional image of the body, what do I have to do? I got to compress the shroud around the whole thing. Now, what happens if you do that when you go and flatten it out again? It distorts the image, right? It looks like a Warsharp's blotch. But the images left on there were from a 3D object, many parts of which never made contact with the shroud. Again, this is Bob Buckland's review. This is the foot region blood splatter, and it's around the ankle region. And you can see here, it's hard to see in this area, but there is, on the right-hand side there's a blood pool around here this is the back image. It pooled, as it was laid down, it pooled around the back waist area. Okay? Again, is you seeing a picture develop here, a pattern develop here? This is the perfect representation of the New Testament account of the crucifixion. Every single wound is consistent. Not more, not less. Now, this is a map of Mars topography. We took two-dimensional images from a satellite. It's fed back to a computer analyzer, and then we have computer programs that can take something that's initially 3D, rendered 2D, and then what can the computer analysis do? Render it 3D again. But you can only do that with what? a 3D object. You cannot do it with a 2D object, right? They've tried it before, it doesn't work. It's all distorted. So, turns out that this particular gentleman, his name is Peter Schumacher. He's the product engineer for what's called the VP8 image analyzer, which is developed in the 70s. So he helped in 1976. He set up a camera to examine a photo of a high-resolution photo of the shroud. This is 2 years before the actual Shroud of Turin research project was allowed to look at the shroud. But he took the first images using a topography machine, which tries to turn, if something was originally 3D, its 2D image can be used with the VP8 analyzer. And of course, and he published his work in 77, and it was specifically on the 3D source for the image of the shroud. And here is a replica of that. So again, it's not controversial. Whatever made the image on the shroud was itself three-dimensional. No one denies that. Everything I'm telling you now it's been published in mainstream chemical and physics and photography journals. It's pretty much unquestioned. Everyone somewhere is going to find somebody who questions things, but it's fairly mainstream and unassailable, these specific facts. Now again, as I was telling you, that's the actual image in proportion on the negative of the shroud. If you were to stretch it out, if you were to stick a cloth on something with wet paint that's three-dimensional, once you pull it out and flatten it out, it would be distorted. Go home and try it. Paint your face, get your wife to put a sheet on you, and then see if it looks like you. Now, researchers found that reflectance spectra, chemical tests, laser microprobe, Raman spectra, pyrolysis mass spectrometry, X-ray fluorescence, all show, okay, that the image is not painted on in any of the historically documented pigments. We're talking medieval era pigments. As every type of pigment we know of, there is no evidence of any dyes, glues, paints, anything on the shroud. Again, that's been published in Thermochemica, the Chemical Engineering Journal. It's been republished ever since the STRP research team established this in the 80s. No one really questions that. That is one of the most uncontroversial facts about the shroud. Not a single dye or paint is used to make that image. So the question is, what in the world is the image made of? Now here's a close-up of the actual shroud. Each fiber on the shroud is made up of 200 fibrils. And the fibrils, you can see them in this picture, is thinner than a human hair, right? The image is one fibril deep, okay? Not only did they not find evidence of residue of dyes and pigments and paints and glues, if you tried to put any sort of dye or paint onto a fiber of that size, there's 200 fibrils in a fiber, it would soak through 24 of them instantaneously, right? You could never do it on one fibril deep. So there's two lines of evidence against the painting hypothesis or the dyeing hypothesis. Another hypothesis is that the chemical reaction of the sweat with the aloe and myrrh put out like a chemical vapor. Again, that would go more than one fibril deep. And if that was the case, this is the only burial shroud in history with an image on it. It would be commonplace if it was a natural chemical reaction of a normal body with certain burial spices, right? So at this point, we're kind of getting cornered into a little area here that is comfortably unnatural. There's no sign of something akin, the analysis at the end of the day, and this was again published in peer-reviewed secular scientific journals, whatever left an imprint on the shroud was akin, we don't know what it was, but it was along the lines of radiation or extreme light energy, okay, some sort of hyperphoton impact. We couldn't do that today, by the way. You could not recreate, nobody today could recreate that image. We have no technology now. Even though we can emit radiation, we can control ultraviolet light, We have photon lasers, etc. We couldn't do whatever this was. And it has some hallmarks that are unlike ultraviolet radiation. For example, because this shroud, by the way, was done perfectly in line with Jewish burial customs, what does it say in Leviticus? What did the Jews obey at the time of Jesus? Leviticus in the Old Testament. Were you allowed to mix cotton with wool or plant-based linens with wool, with animal-based linen? No. And that's exactly how this shroud is presented, right? So the reality is, everything about this is consistent with a Jerusalem-based single-thread shroud that has an image on it that is akin to radiation exposure. And again, published, argued, debated in peer-reviewed chemical journals. There's another paper on that. Now, do you notice something interesting about this particular image? Look at the mouth area. What do you see? Do you see almost like someone grinning and baring his teeth? Do you see that there? It's a little easier for me to see because I'm up close. And it's a little distorted when I try and magnify it from that image. But again, dentists have looked at this particular image, and can you see the columns up and down there? Everyone accepts that there's teeth there, but the problem is the teeth columns go behind the mustache as well. Now, how would that be possible? Maggie, look at my teeth. You don't see them go that long. Well, it's consistent with the root images showing up as well. It's basically an X-ray image of someone's mouth. And now, if we go below towards the hand and wrists, you'll see something interesting. Here's the wrist to fingertip length right there. However, the finger length is 3/4 of the length of the wrist to the wrist. So if you hold your hand up, here's your wrist, here's the end of your fingers. It should be about 50% of your hand, shouldn't it? So what would make it that you could see fingers going all the way basically here? Well, those of you who know anything about anatomy is underneath this skin surface of my palm is basically muscle and skin and fat. But the finger bones continue to about here, okay? Now, this is true of both images. You're seeing an X-ray image of hands, essentially, right? And if you look, it's a little hard, again, from your vantage point, but the fingers are in a position kind of like this, okay? Does that make sense to any of you? Why would you think the hands would be clocked into this kind of a position? Actually, no, let's not get that started. I'm telling you right now anyways. So this is a medical condition called the hand of benediction, or median nerve palsy. So what happens is, if you sever the median nerve here, the hand gets stuck like this because this median nerve controls the muscles that extend these two fingers and flex the thumb and the index and the middle finger. So if you cannot do this or you cannot do that, and you're in excruciating pain, you'll get locked into this position, right? And again, that is by severing the median nerve right there. Now, why would crucifixion sever that median nerve? Because the nail has to be driven right below the wrist area, it's between these two forearm bones, so that you can hook a guy and his body weight supported by that structure. Because if you put it right here, what do you think would happen when you hung him with full body weight? Rip right through, right? So this is exactly where the median nerve passes. All the iconography of Jesus, by the way, this is some of the older ones. Look at his hand, right? Stuck in the nerve palsy fashion. And I'm a former Catholic, raised in a Catholic part of the world. Priests and popes to this day use the hand of benediction to give you a benediction. That's why it's called the hand of benediction. Everybody follow me so far? It's not a gang sign, it's the hand of benediction. What do you also notice? It's all the way from the neck of his body, front and back, down to the ankles. You see the welt marks all over the body. You see those stripes everywhere? There's about 200 on the back surface and over 100 on the front surface. Whatever made the wounds of that was done 300 times. Now we have, from the first century Roman world, we have what they used when they were flagellating people, right? Like, you guys seen The Passion of the Christ where they're whipping Jesus? Mel Gibson actually used the shroud for that scene as an indicator of what was going on. Now, you could take, this is literally a Roman era cat o' nine tails from that part of the world. Now, you see the little dumbbell pellets at the bottom there? That's what causes the damage. You can literally, and this is a still shot from a video, you could take those pellets and they match perfectly with every single one of those welt marks. So those welt marks were genuinely ratioed to the exact size and shape of a Roman cat o' nine tails. And mainly visible and testable from the negative image of the shroud, which we've had only the last 100 or so years. Now, there is, this is, I'll usually get pushback from Christians when they say, well, some of this stuff from the shroud doesn't match up with Scripture. I disagree, but let's look at one specific passage. This is from John 20, verse 7. And the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, was not lying with the linen cloths, but folded in a place by itself. So to Christians that have challenged me on this, two problems are presented here. A, there's supposed to be a face cloth, and then there's linens, which means there's more than one shroud, potentially, right? So let's look at what some of the solutions to that might be. A, the wrapping mentioned by John in that section of the gospel is simply lost. It was on him, and again, you could go get an x-ray right now wearing a jean jacket and a sweater and a parka, and all you would see is bones. Radiation would blow through all of that stuff. You could be covered in roses. The only thing that would block the x-ray would be metal. So you'd just see, if you're wearing a jean jacket getting an x-ray taken, you'd just see the metal buttons on your x-ray. So whatever was on him besides the shroud, if it's lost, would not have acted as a barrier to whatever made the image on the shroud. And the head wrapping, again, could be anything, and it could be lost. Okay? So to me, it's not a barrier. And if there was, let's say, 2 shroud wrappings over him, and only one has remained and survived, again, we would still have the shroud today as it is. There is no real barrier to the narrative in the New Testament as far as I can see it. Somebody else proposed that typically Jesus was buried in a hurry because they had to put him away before sundown, and it was almost sundown when he died. Because why? It's unlawful for Jews to touch a dead body on the Passover and the Sabbath. When does the Sabbath and the Passover start? When the sun goes down. So he didn't have the perfect, typical Jewish burial, but he had it done quickly. One of the things that we know very little, by the way, of Jewish burial customs from the first century, and they certainly weren't not like the Egyptian style, because in the Egyptian style, they thought the body remains after death, and they need to preserve the body for that passage into the afterworld, whereas Jews basically said, no, we just wait for the flesh to rot, then we preserve the bones in an ossuary, like the high priest Caiaphas' ossuary is known from Jesus' time. But they basically did a simple burial to just clean things up. And what they sometimes did is they put a shroud, like we see with the artwork we saw earlier, and they put a single string around it. Now, that's 2 pieces of linen. That could be the 2 linens. Or there could have been 2 shrouds. And whatever else was there was lost. The other linen could have been lost. Now, another interesting piece of religious relic is something called the Sudarium of Oviedo. Sudarium is a Greek word meaning face cloth. Again, the word for that is Greek, because John was written in Greek. It's used in other works of antiquity around the time of Jesus, and it can mean something that literally just wraps like a handkerchief, or it can be a face cloth. Now, we actually it's held in a cathedral in the city of Oviedo, Spain, and this is what it looks like. It's been tested. The blood on it is AB positive, just like the shroud's blood. okay? And it goes back, we have that, we can trace it back to at least 614 AD in Palestine. Okay, so it's been with the Christian community since the 600s AD. Doesn't mean it's authentic. It's an interesting piece of art. It's an interesting artifact that we have. Another thing that's interesting is somebody took an image from the face cloth, the sudarium. This is the sudarium's blood pattern as imaged. And this is the back image on the shroud where there's the crown of thorns region, right? And they do an overlay to see if there's a match. Let's take a look.
The actual shape of the stones, if you do an overlay of the two, well, the actual shape, the way the blood flowed coincides on both cloths.
Okay, interesting. Now the question is, why isn't there an image on the sudarium if there's an image on the shroud? Right? I don't know. This may be a match. I don't know. Could also be that the sudarium was used as a pat down to get some of the blood off, then was removed, the other head covering was applied, and then the shroud. Again, there's many logical possibilities to work around that and to make sense of all the different pieces of data. I'm not troubled by the New Testament narrative being contradicted at all. Burial spices. Another question I'm asked is, it says in Scripture he was buried with aloes and myrrh, about 75 pounds, as is the Jewish custom. They say to me, where's the aloe and myrrh on the shroud? Well, I have some answers to that. Could it not be the source of the 58 strains of pollen you find all over it? Right? There's definitely evidence of herbs and spices and plant-based stuff all over the shroud. Right? Another possibility is, what if there's the body, the myrrh, the first shroud that we've lost, and then the actual shroud we still have on top of that. So the X-ray, the radiation image imprint would have gone through everything, including the last shroud, and we only have the last shroud with us. There's many possibilities. Because at the end of the day, you can't just ignore the shroud after seeing all this data. This is a unique piece of phenomenon that the BBC 2 years ago ran a documentary on the shroud. And they're basically essentially kind of in a roundabout way saying it could be the real thing. Because they're admitting to the science behind it, that it's radiation image burn, no paints or dyes, that it's a photonegative image. It has chemical markers for Jerusalem, which no one would have thought of 200 years ago, let alone 1,000 years ago, etc., etc. What you will find, the major pushback you will get, is the 1988 carbon dating that was done on a fragment of the shroud. When this thing was done, the newspapers were all over the world, front page. We've now proved it. The shroud is a medieval forgery. Why were they so confident? Because the testing showed dates. Now, by the way, you see this is the front image of the shroud, that half of the shroud. You see that little corner down there? This is blown up to show you this. From this corner, they took a strip and they handed it to three different laboratories to do carbon-14 dating on it. Okay, one in Oxford, one in Zurich, and two were done in Arizona. So that was try to recreate a similar dating without without bias confirmation. It's a good way to do this stuff. The Arizona tests came back 1238 and 1430, Oxford's 1246, Zurich's 1376. So with the error margin thrown in, it's about the same range of time. So that was considered, well, how can you argue with carbon-14 dating? Even the BBC, when they ran this a couple of years ago, because this was done in 1988, they've picked up on something that's been in the literature since this dating is, they're saying, look, something's funny here, because the shroud is so uniquely unexplainable. The only thing that stands in the way of the shroud being seen as authentic, essentially, is this particular series of tests, the carbon-14 tests. Now, there is a problematic scenario that we run into when we try and hold up the carbon-14 radiocarbon dating as absolutely authoritative. For example, and again, multiple papers have been published on this since 1988. The part of the shroud that they took had two problems. Where do you think people throughout the last at least 1,000 years, if not 2,000 years, where do you think they hold the shroud when they go to transport it? exactly on the corners, on the edges. It'd be about this wide. And sweat, residue. The most contaminated part of the shroud is the part that was used for testing. It's also the only parts of the shroud that they've now analyzed. Ray Rogers, who was the head chemist at the STRP project in '78, he's been at the forefront of this, and he said this. He goes, listen, several fragments were given by the Vatican to the Shroud of Turin research team and were tested with chemical tests. These tests showed, and also microscopic imagery, that there were two types of fibers given to the researchers. Ones that were threaded into the shroud in the Middle Ages as patch repair jobs, and original shroud fibers. That's the only edge of the shroud that has ever had patchwork repair, is right on those corners and along the periphery. So there's a reason to doubt the actual results from that area. They could be accurately dating patch fibers, right? That's at least a very plausible thing to hold up. Now, interestingly, and there's been, again, I could find you tons of papers on exactly that. And these are not Christians. These are just scientists who are saying, the dating's questionable. Now, interestingly enough, two members from the STRP research team back in the early 80s paid to have their own radiocarbon dating done on samples they had identified, because remember, Jews never mixed fibers. So that's why we know it's a patch repair job, and it does date to the Middle Ages. So these guys, two of the STRP research guys, had their own dating done in a private lab, and their results were 70 and 200 AD. Never published, never officially done, so it's basically an obscure result. But these guys were not obscure guys. They were part of the original STRP team, and they're saying, listen, we know that this other dating's wrong. It's on a tainted part of the shroud, and it doesn't match the other dating we took. And if you take their dating and everything else we've looked at, you see a coherent picture, right? That's powerful. That makes sense of literally, you got to look for a theory that makes sense of everything. Everything. That's the image, front and back. So just to recap, then we'll do Q&A. It's a radiation type image. It's a photographic image, where it's a negative of a sourced image. It's from a 3D object or person. It's got primate blood on it, verifiably. You see X-ray images of bones and teeth on it. It's a perfect match for the Roman flagella. You see the crown of thorns wounds, wrist and ankle wounds, exactly where there would be for crucifixion. The arms were raised during the bleeding process. It matches the iconography throughout the ages of Jesus' representation. The chemical analyses are geographically matched to Jerusalem. And there's no contradiction to the New Testament narrative. So the question is, what is it? I don't know, but those facts are real. Any questions? And I'll have someone, Darius, if you can run around and be my mic boy, because this is being recorded, and I want your questions to be heard as well.
So was the radiation, do you think, from the light from the angels that rolled away the stone?
No, it would be from the body itself. So it would be the moment of resurrection, right? Whatever power was emitted from going from a dead body to a living body, or maybe just transcending through the crowd and I don't know what happened, how it happened. It would have to come from the body, not from the outside.
I guess it's studied so they haven't really had opportunity to say analyze what the different pollens were. Was that it, right? Because like the last time it was actually scientifically studied was how many years ago, and then
Yeah, no, I mean they did as much of an analysis that can be done,
Yeah.
and they narrowed it down to you know, almost all the pollens are found specifically only in that area. A good chunk, you know, a third of them are never found in Europe, right? So then you sit back and go, what scenario? There's no way they would have known any of that chemical analysis stuff in the medieval ages. Never.
When was the last time they were able to do that chemical analysis again? Like they haven't
78,
done
1978,
78. So with how many years and technology's improved since then, you can imagine.
Yeah,
if
but the
they've
raw
done it
data
now.
has been looked at over and over
Right.
again,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So we've gotten some ability to revamp our analyses because we have the raw data sitting right there. That's one of the reasons. The raw data from the 1988 carbon dating is what's sparked a controversy. Many other people were looking at it going, these samples don't make sense. And that's a highly questionable area. It's got patchwork. It's been held by how many hands for thousands of years? That's not a great place to take a sample. You should go right where take strands of fibers somewhere within the center of the image where no one's probably ever touched it. Then we can get a better sample, right? And again, supposedly, that was done and it gave a much earlier date.
When was it first discovered?
The first record we have of it is from the 1300s.
1300. And is
Right.
there any way of knowing whoever discovered it made any money off it?
I'm sure that, I didn't look that up, right? But people have made money. Most of its history,
Yeah.
it's been, they don't show it very much. The place where it's kept right now, I don't think they make much money off of it. They only show it every few years, and they don't charge anything.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
How do they currently store it so that it doesn't disintegrate? I mean, if it is, it's like 2,000 years old.
Oh, yeah.
So
No,
how do they preserve it?
it's high tech. It's in Turin, in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. And it's hermetically sealed. There's no air. It's vacuum packed. There's no light or air touching it, right? It's completely, it's as safe as it could possibly be from the environment.
You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the cloth around the head is to shut the mouth when you die.
Yes, that's
So
why
it's to make-
it
yeah.
would be tied around like
yeah,
that.
it's to make it closed when you,
Yep.
when you're dead, so it doesn't like hang open.
And
I
if you
think.
look at the teeth marks on
Yeah.
the negative, the teeth are touching.
Oh, okay, I understand. Okay.
And he most likely, whoever was crucified, would have died like that.
So you quoted John 20, verse 7, and the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but wrapped together in a place by itself. And, I want to point that out along with John 19, that says, verse 38, that says, and there came also Nicodemus, which at the first came to Jesus by night, and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. Verse 40, then they took the body of Jesus and wound it in linen cloths with the spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. Now, I was looking, this was years ago, I was looking at the Jewish websites, how they had, and the Jewish people, the Jewish websites themselves say that around that time, in biblical times, what they did was they had strips of cloths that they bound around the body, and strips of cloth to bind the hands and then the feet together. And then there was a separate cloth for to wrap around the head, which is mentioned in John 20. So, and then John 19 mentions strips of cloths. And, when Jesus was born, the angels told the shepherds to find a baby wrapped in swaddling cloths, which was striking for them, was remarkable for them, because a swaddling cloth was used, it was tied around a traveler's waist when they were going from one town to another, in case they die along the way, they get beaten or mugged or whatever, or some disease, and they can unwrap it and then wrap the dead body until they get to their destination. So it was not a whole cloth that was used by, even by the indications in the Bible, was not a whole cloth used. And the cloth, the napkin, described as a napkin here for the face, would not be marked on that whole cloth, because it was one cloth and then strips of cloth around the
Yeah.
body, and then strips
I know where you're
for
going. I get it.
the ankles and the.
Yes, and there isn't a singular style of burial that we can for sure pin down from archaeological evidence or textual analysis. They sometimes wrap things, they sometimes did not, right? And it doesn't matter, because none of that would have blocked the image, the radiation image left on the outer shroud, right? Because we do have a cloth that has a radiation burn image on it that matches what a crucified person would have exactly looked like. And you could have put spices, aloe, myrrh, other cloths around it, and none of those things would have blocked the radiation. So it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah. There's also an article I read on the Crusades, and there was a soldier on the Fourth Crusade that was that claimed to have the shroud, and
I spoke about that at the beginning, yeah.
oh, did you?
Yeah, yeah.
And then the bishop in the Catholic Church at that time tracked him down, and he confessed, and it's supposed to be documented because he wrote a letter confessing to the bishop that he had done that. They had used that cloth, for like a healing crusade thing.
Sure, but
Yeah,
the
yeah,
one
yeah.
I'm talking about, the record of him, all he says in his memoirs is that I saw a cloth, an image of Christ raised every Friday at the Constantinople chapel to the public. That's all he says. He doesn't claim to have it. He doesn't ever talk about it or make money off of it. So whatever you're talking about was a separate incident. Then it shows up 100 years later, for sure. That's where we have the first continuous record of it, in a guy who was married to a woman who was a descendant of one of the leaders of that Fourth Crusade in Constantinople. Again, all that's circumstantial, but it forms a picture that could be a pattern. Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll ask somebody else. Darius? Oh, you'll get your chance, don't worry.
Yeah, I just wondered what, if anybody knows anything about what the Jews used this stuff they embalmed the bodies with. What was the
They
purpose
never
of
embalmed
that?
the bodies.
Oh, well, okay.
No,
so
only
they-
Egyptians did that. They would let the body rot, and then they would preserve the bones in an ossuary. That was their custom.
But they didn't believe the soul was coming back to the body like the Egyptians
No,
did.
they hated the Egyptian customs for obvious reasons. It was antithetical to theirs, and they'd been enslaved by them, right?
Hello. Thank you tonight. This has been wonderful. Wondering if, first of all, linen, does that mean cotton? And then second to that, could the large piece of material been used to transport the body from the cross to the tomb?
No, it would have most likely been, because the way the image is on there, he's obviously been placed in a final position with the arms brought down here. Not unlikely to have happened on his way, there's evidence of the way the body is positioned. There's evidence of rigor mortis. For example, when they've recreated it from the 3D topographical image, the body's kind of stuck like this, with the head like that, which would be typical if you're hanging like this and your feet are like this as you die. And then you get quite stiff fairly quickly after you die, but you don't have full-blown rigor mortis. You can still manipulate the body. So once it was finally placed like this has all the markings of the final position of the body, right? So it would have been used while he was in the tomb, most likely.
And the linen, would it be cotton? Is that what linen would
It's
have
some
been?
plant-based. I don't know if it's cotton. I don't think it's cotton.
Flax.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It was, and again, very typical of that part of the world at that time. And an expensive one, by the way. The size and perfect weave and weave patterns, which makes sense because who got the cloth? Who took care of the burial expenses? A rich man, Joseph of Arimathea.
Okay. And can we tell how tall Jesus was from this?
I think he was like 5'9", 5'10", which would have been kind of tall for that day, right? And I think they say, yeah, 5'9" and 170 pounds, and fairly well built, right? When you're a stone mason carpenter your whole life, you don't look like an accountant. Nothing wrong with accountants.
And so that imprint, it's okay, I can.
Well, I need to hear your question for the video.
So, but the imprint then, would that had happened, I'm just trying to think, like, when he actually resurrected, no, when he was full of possibly even like higher energy, that it made that imprint?
Well, that's
And so-
theory. I don't think that's not a silly theory
Yeah.
at all. To me,
The
my
bigger-
personal theory is that at the moment of resurrection, the power that left the body left an imprint on the shroud.
Okay, so my question, I guess, is, well, we don't know, but like for us, most of us here, we all believe, and so we believe, yes, this is true, this really happened, it's not a forgery, but I'm just wondering, like, the bigger reason why God would allow it to happen, and so,
Yeah, I mean, but look at what it's turned into. Like, with time, we've gotten more information out of the shroud than they would have had even in the years
So it's
prior.
more proof, more
Yeah,
evidence
and
as
the further
to
the further away
the
we are
truth.
timeline from the lifetime of his life, he's giving us this data to remind us that
Yeah.
he really sent his son,
Right.
who really died,
right?
who really bodily resurrected. Which, again, that's not a faith weakener, that's a faith strengthener. I believed in Christ before I came across the Shroud of Turin, right? It's not why I believe, but I look at it and I think to myself, it has to be explained. And it's not easily explained, to the point where the BBC is essentially hinting at the fact that they believe it's authentic. It's one of the most uncontroversial parts of Christianity, is, in terms of our critics, is they have a very, very difficult time explaining away every bizarre aspect of that shroud. It's conveniently beyond the scope of a medieval forger. It's beyond the scope of our modern technological capacity. So the question is, what is it? It's not like seeing Jesus in your tortilla shell. Let's put it that way. It's a whole different class.
That's cool.
Out of curiosity, let's do a poll. Who here, and I don't care, you won't hurt my feelings if you don't convert, but who here believes differently? It doesn't mean you believe it's the authentic thing. Who here has been swayed on some level by tonight's presentation? All right. I mean, and who, out of the people whose hands raised, I want to include those who already believed it was authentic. How about, let's try it again. Who here has been swayed or believes it's authentic? All right, well, there's some hard nuts in here, but I didn't waste all of my time.
Did you make this yourself?
No, my wife did it.
Oh,
No, I did do it.
actually you? Okay. Well, I was just asking. I thought it might have
Yeah,
been,
yeah.
you know, your friend, your cousin, or something
No,
like that.
this
maybe.
is all my work.
Okay, maybe
Yeah.
another believer. And the blood on it, I guess they wouldn't have painted with blood. It definitely had to be someone's blood, right? Like, might have not used someone's blood, or would it have to
Well,
be just?
who would have known in the medieval era to use bilirubin, hemoglobin, and albumin?
Well,
No
wouldn't
paint-
that just be blood though? It wouldn't. You would
Yeah, I
have to
mean,
separate
I
it.
guess you could have gotten there with some blood,
Put it
but
on
but
there,
it's
yeah.
it would have to be, you would have to be on whatever was underneath the shroud and make light contact with it. So yeah. Now, by the way, someone suggested at one point, what if you took a statue in the medieval era, superheated it to leave? Now, it's a nice theory, but here's the problem: heat leaves a specific marker on cellulose. And we've analyzed the actual, to the cellular level of these fibrils on the shroud. It's not a heat marker. Plus, to only allow heat to go one fibril deep would literally take, impossible by hand, by the way. It would have to be pushed and removed within less than 1/100th of a second. Problem number one. Problem number two is the actual molecular structure of the fibrils have not been warped by heat. We've analyzed that. So we've ruled out heat.
So I think I'm still confused about this. The image is, because you said radiation burn, but then we're also talking about blood. So there's like little blood splatters and stuff.
Correct.
on it. Is
That's
that
two
what we're
different
talking-
reasons for an image.
Okay. So the image itself is a radiation burn.
Correct.
But then there's also blood splatters.
The blood is
on
an
it.
actual chemical contact.
Yeah. So the image itself is not blood. It's
Correct. The only blood on there is what we see as blood marks around the head, forearms, ankles, and side.
Is there any, because, if this is true, this would be a really, really big deal. And so is there any scripture in the Old Testament and any prophecies on it?
Not that I know of. There is a
Okay.
unique verse in Corinthians, I think it's 1st or 2nd Corinthians, I can't remember which chapter, where Paul says, was not the crucified Christ shown publicly to you? And for a long time, if you read Matthew Henry or John Gill or some of these mainstream theologians, they don't quite know what he meant by that. And somebody theorized that obviously if it's the original shroud, it would have been in possession of Christians from the beginning. And was it not part, we know from 1300 AD onwards, 1357 AD onwards, it has been a part of Christian possession and ministry. Is it possible he's mentioning the shroud? I don't know. It's not definitive.
Yeah, I take that scripture to mean the crucified Christ who appeared to the 500 people.
It could be, but
Yeah.
he specifically says to the Corinthians, was shown to you.
Okay.
They'd never seen
Yeah.
it.
Okay, so what about Old Testament prophecy? There's nothing there?
I don't think so.
Okay, and then did the
But
early church...
would there have to be in order for something like that to happen?
Yeah, did the early church fathers ever mention it?
Good question. I didn't look that up. It's mentioned
Yeah.
around, again, the earliest mention we have of it, I think, is 600s.
Okay, so you don't believe that there's a possibility that it's part of the Great Delusion?
Oh, it's possible. Sure.
Yeah, yeah.
But how would that work against our faith? How would it be a delusion? It's a faith strengthener. It works in favor of belief.
Yeah, but maybe something would be done to it later on, because the Pope is known to pray to it, to the
Sure,
shroud, and he's not an ignorant man,
Right.
so he knows what's on the shroud.
Yeah, thank you.
I know you're winding up, but could you humor us is it possible to pull up the picture again and to point out the radiation image versus the blood splatters, just to get a visual of that?
Yeah, so I'll get a close-up here. So and again, this is the difference between when you take a photograph of the shroud, this is the negative of the photograph of the shroud, the blood shows up in these ultra-white patterns right there, which also happens to be where if you test it, it has the compounds that blood breaks down into as it decomposes. Also, there's blood on the forearms. You see that on the back of the arms, on the front of the arms. The very highly white blotches are all blood. There's a blood shadow here. It pools around the back as it would be consistent with the thorax wound. Which still, the heavy bleeding would be over with because his blood's not pumping anymore. He's bled out a whole bunch. They clean him up. They put him down, but some blood still seeps out, right? That follows the pattern. And they've analyzed this. Pathologists have analyzed this. And it's whoever did this, if it wasn't real, did it very, very cleverly. Perfectly lifelike, right? And the real, again, two things that are really, the fact that it's not something made up of anything within our current even technological capacity. It is not painted, dyed, chemically tainted. It's 100% some sort of burn that is closest we can think of is radiation or ultraviolet energy. They didn't have that capacity in the medieval era. So whenever it was made, they didn't have, can't even do it now. So the question is, what else could it be? Is it history's first photograph? Right? Well, thank you for coming. Next month we'll be doing one on St. Patrick. So we're going to have green beer in the lobby too. No, we're not. Thank you.